Good day, everyone. Happy Friday. We will get the session kicked off here in just a minute. Today's the last day of February, so hopefully you're not too under the gun when it comes to client deliverables. But I thank you for joining me today. Who do we have in the chat? Hey, Greg, how are you? Good to see you. Okay, cool. Well, as folks are starting to stream in here, a couple of notes. This is going to be a little bit different of a format than we've traditionally done for our webinar series. This is very much a watch me work session where I will be going through from soup to nuts how we get people booked as guests on podcasts. For those that don't know, Podchaser used to run a guest booking agency called Podchaser Connect. I ran that division for about 18 months before it was acquired by a different agency in the space. And a lot of what we did on behalf of our clients, and we did have quite a few clients to the tune of booking about 80 clients per month as guests on podcasts. There were a couple of things that we needed to figure out. One was going to be the scalability of podcasts guest booking at that level. Two was quality. So, how do we make sure that our clients are getting everything that they need out of the podcast interview experience, but while also maintaining that honestly kind of crazy level of volume? And what we're going to go over today is going to be a lot of the frameworks that I developed, our team developed in order to help our users get the most out of Pro because it's really what we were doing is using Pro day in and day out to find best fit opportunities on behalf of our clients. So if you've ever been on a webinar with us before, you're going to hear some terms or some phrases that probably sound familiar, but we're going to get a lot more action oriented with that today. And we're going to have a little bit of a schizophrenic in some ways session because this is literally how I work and can almost guarantee that 90% of you do so in a much more organized way. But again, you're going to get this inside view into like what goes in my head, and usually that entails just dumping all of my thoughts into a big old Google Doc. So we will pop open the Podchaser Pro platform at some point in time. We're just doing a quick maintenance sync on that side, so otherwise we'd be in there right now. But again, today's session is all about watching me work, how we're going to get a guest actually booked as a guest on a podcast, and we're going to use Podchaser CEO Bradley Davis as the guinea pig. Now, of course, Bradley's no stranger to podcasts. He's appeared on quite a few to date, but we are going to do it through the lens as if he were a client and I was like his PR agent. So, without further ado, the session is going to be recorded, of course. There will be slides as well as the recording that'll be available next week. If you have any questions in the chat, please send them through, especially as like you're literally watching like my brain kind of move. Sometimes I might skip over some things that I take for granted and you might want me to back up. So we will get through probably the first 20 to 30 minutes, like kind of on the ideation stage, and then we'll also open it up to Q&A towards the back half of the webinar as well. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of the day, and that is how are we going to book Bradley, our CEO, as a guest on other people's podcasts? And I think the first thing that I always like to do is get a deep understanding of kind of who he is, what he cares about, what kind of bona fides he has, that sort of thing. Now, obviously, I know Bradley very well, so it's going to be a little bit easier for me. You might not have the benefit with some of your clients to have a one-to-one relationship where they're merely a Slack message away. But we'll also go over a couple different ways to tease this out if and when you do get FaceTime with clients, because oftentimes, and I know this being on the receiving end, the company that you're working with, your client, they might have an executive assistant or chief of staff that sends over a CV or a bio. And while that's obviously very important and a good kind of foundational content for us to work from, what we really want to start to do is unpacking some of these stories that might exist within our guests' kind of journey. And there's one framework in particular that's really helpful for that. It's popularized by Matthew Dix. If you haven't read Matthew's works, I would definitely recommend it. He's a storytelling legend. He's won quite a few, I think 12 or 13 Moth awards. So the Moth is a storytelling competition, and he's one of the most illustrious Moth speakers of all time. But in any case, bearing the lead here, his storytelling framework is quite simple. It goes first, last, best, worst. And I'll pop this in here as well so you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. And I'll just do it right underneath topics. So if you were to make a grid or a table, I'll just insert a table real quick. What we can do is just put columns on the top here. So first, last, best, worst. I need to add one more column here. So made a column to the left. And then for each of these columns, we're also going to put an associated topic that's relevant to our guest, right? So I guess before I get too deep into that, like who is Bradley? Bradley's a founder and CEO of Podchaser. Podchaser's journey began 6 years and 10 months ago. So there's quite a bit of storytelling that we could probably pull through there, including things like why Bradley started the company in the first place, how he initially found product market fit, what was the best sales call he was ever on, what was the hardest part of raising venture capital. So again, I'm mentioning all of those because we can use those topics as kind of jumping off points. So let's do that real quick. Let's do, um, we'll do PMF just to begin. So like when did the question I would ask to Bradley if I was doing an interview with him, and this is obviously pre-podcast guest booking. This is for me to extract as much knowledge out of his head as possible so I can take these vast wide stories and then condense them down into podcast guest pitch. It's going to be relevant for the show that I'm pitching. So if we're talking about product market fit, I might ask Bradley, what was the first time you thought Podchaser experienced product market fit? For those that don't know what product market fit is, it's kind of this North Star metric that most technology companies, SaaS companies such as ourselves, it's this what we try to get to because that means that we've found a market for our product and you start to get inbound leads from that. And then you really start to understand like what kind of problem you're actually solving and for like a general market. I know a lot of you guys are communicators on the call today, whether that's PR, marketing, reputation, that sort of thing. Hopefully that means you've found product market fit with us and vice versa. But this is something that is very difficult to attain and very difficult to achieve, especially for startups. And I'm listing this one first because when we think about Bradley, obviously he's an entrepreneur. Um, I know this as background, but Podchaser wasn't Bradley's first business that he started. He's got probably half dozen or so businesses that he started and tried before ultimately landing on Podchaser. So when we use that as kind of the backdrop, what does that sound like? What kind of shows we might want to get Bradley booked on? Well, that's going to be entrepreneurship types of shows, right? So again, there's going to be this huge universe that Bradley can address, but how do we get like the snappiest, crunchiest, spiciest types of stories to interject into those? So tell me about the first time experience product market fit. When interviewing him, I would want to ask questions like, where were you? What happened? Why did you feel as strongly as you did about that? So basically, who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then I've found, especially in working with busy C-suite people, they usually have these stories memorized. They don't often articulate them, but when you do this, it often starts to trigger them and takes them a trip down memory lane where they are, reminiscing about some of these early times, which is going to be good because that's going to be much more compelling to kind of squeeze into a pitch. And the other thing that it does too is if you schedule like an informational interview with your client and it's like pulling teeth to get them to agree to it in the first place because they don't have time, they don't have the bandwidth, whatever it might be. If you can just get that little crack in the door with this, all of a sudden they open up considerably, because this does feel like kind of like a fun exercise to go through. But in any case, we would want to ask the questions, who, what, when, where, why, and how. Okay. So, and that's again just for first. Now, if we wanted to go a little bit different and talk about like what was the best experience you had in finding product market fit, that might be Bradley talking a little bit more about a certain feature that Podchaser released and how widely that was adopted through our client base and prospect base. And one of the things that I would probably point to, having not actually done this exercise with him in advance of this, is our Tell Me Why feature, which is our AI-enabled podcast vetting tool. Obviously, AI has been all the rage over the last couple of years, but especially has reached a fever pitch recently. And just seeing the product analytics within Podchaser Pro and how often our users are using Tell Me Why and some of the results that they're getting, that might be something that, I might tease him with that and say, oh yeah, actually he might then say, I've been on 10 different phone calls with prospects and clients over the last couple of weeks, and every single one of them has mentioned the Tell Me Why AI and podcast vetting feature. So again, I don't want to beat the PMF one down too much, but the next kind of like subcategory of first, last, best, worst we might want to look at. Again, we went entrepreneurship first, so let's get more specific and let's talk about like contract renewal. Again, this is going to be very specific. So again, Podchaser Pro has been a commercial product for a few years now. We've gone through multiple iterations and multiple cycles of clients renewing with us, that sort of thing. And I think one of the interesting things here, as we'll kind of thread this throughout the presentation, is even if a client, even if one of your clients has like a bad story, so like the worst often makes for like really interesting content. And again, depending on the type of podcast that we think is going to be a good fit, sometimes it's going to really resonate with that type of audience. And again, we'll talk a lot more about audience here in a second, but maybe one of our large enterprise API customers had a great amount of success with us, but then they brought in a new director of procurement or director of data sourcing and that sort of thing. They had no knowledge of what Podchaser is or what Podchaser does, and was purely looking at kind of cutting budgets across the board. So Bradley might tell that story, the who, what, where, when, why, and how about it, probably obfuscating the client's actual name, just because. And again, we can use that as like the shaping lesson or like the life lesson that Bradley learned in that, the business lesson that Bradley learned in that, how that changed our process for renewals, how that turned into, one mistake now helped us fix this, gargantuan problem we didn't even know that we had, right? And then how that catapulted Podchaser to, a different echelon of renewals and lifetime value of customers and that sort of thing. So again, we would just do who, who, what, when, where, why, and how. Okay. So again, this is going to be an exercise, first, last, best, worst, that you're going to want to try to get into your client's hands before you even begin some of this. Because again, if we're looking at just our clients' LinkedIn profiles, they're sometimes not going to be all that depth worthy in terms of content or inspiration for how we're actually going to get them booked on podcasts. I think one thing to call out here, of course, is, there is a thread that we're going to see emerge. And for Bradley, that is working in industrial kind of companies as national account manager, territory manager, that sort of thing, and then making this huge leap into tech, and not just tech, but media tech, which is again going to get very specific. And again, like what we want to do here is just find some of these common points and figure out how we're going to kind of lace that into this process. So again, follow the bouncing ball with me a little bit here, because my mind starts spinning pretty quickly, drumming up new ideas, and then hopefully you can see that play in real time. So one thing to call out, especially with Bradley's kind of LinkedIn profile here, is of course we were acquired by Acast in 2022. Now, we talked a little bit about entrepreneurship as potentially being a theme that we're going to run with, especially as it pertained to product market fit. And we had experienced product market fit to the extent that we were actually acquired by a larger company. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, of course, most people start businesses for that freedom of running your own thing, kind of exiting the corporate world and entering into like your own manifest destiny mode, if you will. And ultimately, most entrepreneurs start it to either sell it or gain kind of that freedom. Now, Bradley did both. And when we talk about like acquisition, of course, exits are going to be a very interesting topic for us to discuss on podcasts. This is also going to be somewhat of a gray area as well, depending on your client's legal team and that sort of thing as well. So like there's gonna be some things that Bradley could talk about as part of Podchaser getting acquired by Acast that of course we would not be able to talk about in a public sphere. But in any case, I think we talk more generally about the process of getting acquired. How long did it take? All those types of things as well. Okay, so there's that. And then the other thing, if we wanted to be a little bit more specific. And this is again going to kind of play into how we talk about audience in a second. But Bradley's also based in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, right? Not if you could name five entrepreneurs that came out of OKC, I would give you probably $5 for that. So it's a pretty unique angle. So how do you start a tech company that's successful enough to actually get acquired from Middle America, right? When we talk about tech, we're often thinking about San Francisco, we're talking about New York, some cases LA, Austin, Miami of recent as well. So there's another interesting kind of angle in that entrepreneurship side of it, if in fact that's the route that we want to take. So again, I think from a background perspective, yes, we're going to look at our clients' bios. Yes, we're going to look at their CVs. Yes, we want to see some of the content they're already publishing on their social channels, whether that be LinkedIn or X or Substack or whatever it might be, because that's going to also help us inform what some of our targets should be and how we're going to go through this process together. So speaking of topics, I want to drill into that a little bit further. So I like to create kind of like general topics first and then do some subcategories off of that. So again, we're a business. Business might be the most generic term that exists in the English language, honestly, because it could mean so many different things to so many different people. So in the effort to get a little bit more specific with it, we can talk about it from the SaaS perspective, so software as a service. We can talk about it as data as a service. We can talk about marketing, generally speaking. We can talk about remote and distributed work. Again, that's going to be an interesting angle because Podchaser is fully remote, fully distributed, always has been, always will be. And right now, something that's happening in news cycles is all of the return to work mandates. And that might be an interesting thing for us to capitalize on, just given kind of like the public perception of these employers that are forcing their employees to come back to work, including the federal government and all of like the downstream effects of that as well. So that could be something that Bradley could talk about in an effort to kind of newsjack, if you will, if you're familiar with that term. So that's definitely an option. We already talked about entrepreneurship, so that could look like startups, venture capital. Podchaser did raise a couple of venture capital rounds, so there's going to be a slew of podcasts that are all about how to get funded. Bradley can obviously talk considerably for a considerable amount of time about those trials and travails of becoming funded, and what that meant for the business. Scaling, so great. Once you get your first customer, how do you get your 10th customer? How do you get your 100th, and so on? Product market fit, we already talked about. Pivoting, that could be something that we take a look at. For those that don't know, Podchaser started out as the IMDb for podcasts, and this is a narrative that worked really well in our funding cycles. It wasn't as applicable when it came to like the commercial value prop that Podchaser currently offers. And we still see some of that IMDb narrative kind of come through, which I can talk about in a bit. But part of my job and as head of growth and strategy for Podchaser is positioning us on a new plane. So yes, that's our past. We are obviously very proud of that. And this is kind of where we need to set the new direction. So our pivot has kind of been from the IMDb for podcasts to the ultimate podcast database, and most recently, our positioning is pivoted a little bit more so to the podcast intelligence engine, which again can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in any case, pivoting is also going to be an interesting thing that we could potentially bring up as well. Acquisition we already talked about too. Now, to get into more of kind of the meat and potatoes of it, and this is where we're going to actually kind of build some of our pitches together. Again, most of you on this call, I'm going to assume, are PR and comms folk. But when we talk about public relations, obviously that could be a very, very broad topic. So, like, how do we get an angle that's going to leave the podcast audience as well as the podcast host with something more than, hey, there's this cool tool that exists called Podchaser Pro, which really becomes like a very thinly veiled sales pitch. So instead, we can talk about the rise of podcasts. We've got very interesting first-party data that we've sourced from surveys, through industry reports, that sort of thing, talking about where podcasts have been and where they're going next. We can also talk about the shrinking newsroom factor that exists. So again, shouldn't be any surprise. Newsrooms are shrinking across the country, but especially across the globe through various acquisitions, as well as just the decentralization of media, which is again going to kind of be part and parcel of that as well. So absent like these networks that have kind of vast control over like what types of narratives are working, the decentralization of media has made for the rise of citizen journalism, right? And so many podcasters that we work with, so many podcasters you've probably already pitched yourselves are very much independent. They don't associate with a network. They don't even have a publisher. It's just them. So again, that's going to give us much more opportunity as a PR kind of community to go out and find those opportunities. So that becomes a very meta conversation in a lot of ways. So we definitely want to substantiate that with data to make it a little bit more interesting, and then probably also provide some case studies, examples, and more interesting kind of tidbits outside of, yeah, we know that media is changing and all that. And then finally, public relations, one thing that we're working on, pretty steadily over the last 6 months and will continue is media monitoring. And how do we uncover conversations that are happening about our clients in real time? How do we understand what kind of the public perception of some of these stories and that sort of thing? And I'll give an example of that in a bit, especially as we kind of write our pitch. Then, of course, marketing. We could talk about podcast advertising. We could talk about audience targeting. We could talk about audience insights, contextual targeting, ad tech. And I think this is a really interesting thing as well because, Google's been telling us about the deprecation of third-party cookies for so long, and obviously Meta, so Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, a lot of their customer acquisition costs have increased considerably. So a lot of, marketers are trying to figure out, well, where can we deploy dollars that are going to resonate from a brand awareness perspective as well as a direct response perspective. And again, using some of Podchaser's own proprietary data, we can weave a pretty interesting narrative around what brands are doing without relying on the Googles and the Metas of the world when it comes to advertising as well. And then last but not least, we can also kind of sum up some of Bradley's expertise within like the podcast industry. And I think this is where it gets really interesting too, because, the podcast industry or podcasts, generally speaking, are so difficult to discover. You've got your four key players, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and Google/YouTube. They've all kind of created their own walled gardens, and that's to keep as much ad revenue on their own platforms as possible and enter in an aggregator such as Podchaser, where we're collecting all this data from every corner of the podcast universe and putting it into one central spot. And talking about, again, how we get some of our proprietary data, how much first party data we have through some of our providers like player apps and hosting providers, and obviously our parent company being Acast as well. And then also we publish a proprietary report every month, which is called Podchaser 25. If you don't get those emails, please do sign up for it. Pro users, I think you guys get those automatically. But that looks at the top up and coming podcasts. And I think what's interesting about that is maybe we want to pitch to a podcast industry podcast about a review of every month's Podchaser 25. So kind of pitching it as like a recurring guest appearance. And again, we publish these monthly. So, hey, let's do 12 episodes over the course of a year where we're unveiling the Podchaser 25, which is going to show the hottest up and coming podcasts that published their first episode within the last 90 days. And then kind of do some analysis off of that and, almost do like a roundtable discussion with the host as well as maybe a guest from one of the networks that's most frequently publishing new podcasts that are hitting our Podchaser 25 list. So again, this is very much straight off the dome, but these are some of the things that I would be thinking about and why it's important, I think, to put all of these notes down on paper, because again, this is going to be an iterative process. Every podcast is going to be different, which means every pitch is going to be largely different for all these various reasons. So in any case, that's going to be topics. Do we have a question? Adrian, yes, podcast intelligence for smart PR pros. Love that. Love that, doctor. Next, moving on to target audience. So again, you're here and you all represent our target audience, of course, but we're going to look at public relations, media relations, marketing, which again is going to be a very generic term. So we can split that into brand, performance, growth, acquisition, affiliate, and then influencer. And then also we can go more top level with B2B. We've done a very interesting integration with an API partner recently that probably everybody knows about, where they're pulling in podcast data so you can actually see when the CEO of a publicly traded company appears on a podcast and what they said. So now sales reps, marketing leaders, et cetera, can use their own words in targeting, whether that's via cold email or via advertising across any of these channels. So that might be something that we want to take a look at as well. Of course, publishers. So a lot of podcast networks and publishers work with us in addition to. So there might be some interesting things to see about, hey, of the Podchaser 25 shows, and actually we do talk about this quite frequently. The P25 shows, something like 10% of them have guests. When we did our retrospective of looking at the top new podcasts of 2024, which again would be a very interesting thing. Probably earlier in the year, if we would have done it in January or February and have Bradley go out and talk about the data on a podcast, probably would have been better. But we can even look at this, from the first 2 months of 2025 of the new podcasts that we consider breakout success. What are the formats that they're most frequently using? So are they doing, guest interview style podcasts? Are they more narrative driven? Are they moving more towards a roundtable? What percentage of them had a YouTube component? Again, like we have all of those proprietary data points, which is somewhat cheating, I will admit. And if you have a client that works with data or produces data or publishes data, white papers, that sort of thing, you definitely have a significant advantage in this because for whatever reason, people like numbers. And we've seen this play in time and time again. As a quick aside, we had a client in the dating app space, and there's not a ton of differentiation between dating apps. It's a very kind of ubiquitous thing in modern society, of course. So like, how do you stand out? And one of the clients that we worked with had very interesting data about, and they did this in conjunction with like realtor.com, where they were looking at the amount of the dating apps users and how quickly they were entering into relationships they could actually afford rent and move in with somebody. So that's a very novel piece of data. And of course, people are going to want to talk about that because if the trend looks like people are entering into exclusive relationships sooner so they can actually afford rent, that's a very interesting story. They did another one about dating preferences or dating when it came to political preferences, and they did this in conjunction with voter.org. And this was all in an effort to drive voter turnout and voter registration. And it turned out those that had similar, political stances were entering into exclusive relationships at a much higher rate than those that had polar opposites. Might seem a little common sense, but again, to be able to share that data was a very interesting and compelling story, so much so that one of the big kind of lifestyle magazines actually picked up the story and did a feature on it. So now it became kind of like this amplification, not just with the podcast guest appearances, but also it was written in digital ink as well on this publisher's digital kind of storefront as well. And then just kind of wrap us up here. Audience development, universities, audience development again would be more from the network side, and then universities we do work quite a bit with higher ed. Um, that use case is going to be pretty similar to what PR generally speaking is going to look like. And then finally, developers. Those that don't know, we have an API, and there's obviously a lot more things that you can do with an API in terms of data manipulation and coverage and that sort of thing. So could we appeal to a developer audience with some of the things that Bradley could speak to, talking about our API and the various data points you can pull in and some of these things as well. So in any case, that's going to wrap up our target audience. So great. Now we know which topics we kind of loosely want to go after. Next, we took a look at, the target audience and then super zoomed in. And then how do we marry those two things in conjunction with Bradley's experience, right? So that's where we're going to start to look at the content, context, audience, and reach framework. So again, this is something we developed when we were doing this on behalf of clients. So content, we want to know what kind of shows discuss topics that are relevant to Bradley's areas of interest or expertise. Context, we want to unpack what kind of perspective these shows have on said content. So like if we were to use like marketing as the general kind of content topic, right? Contextually, we want to find shows that are open to like new ideas about marketing as opposed to just continuing to bang the drum for the traditional playbook that exists. And in our case, the angle that we want to play is more so along the lines of, hey, Meta is increasingly expensive. Google is increasingly less conversion oriented. Oh, by the way, there exists this whole universe out there called podcast advertising that you haven't tried yet. And here's some of the data that we can supply for that. So again, from a contextual perspective, if the show is all about Google AdWords or all about Facebook advertising, that's not going to be a contextual fit for the angle that we want to play with Bradley. Next to me, audience. So are the shows aligned with Bradley's targets, Podchaser's targets? We just went through those. So hopefully marketing, PR, comms, kind of generally speaking. And then finally reach. So how big are the shows and what are their trajectories? Now, we always list reach last because inevitably, I think the default for most clients is get me on the biggest show possible, which usually sounds like get me on Joe Rogan, get me on the Daily, get me on How I Built This, and all of those types. Now, reach we like to describe as a spectrum. Obviously, your Rogans, NPRs are going to be on the far side of the spectrum where they've got massive reach, very kind of wide areas of subjects that they're discussing. But on the other side of the spectrum, there exists these very niche podcasts. They might not have more than 500, 1,000 listeners on a monthly basis, but the depth in which they're discovering some of these topics and discussion points is so supreme that it only really attracts those that deeply care about those kind of topics as well. So again, to use a real world example with this, if we're looking at a show that's only got about 1,000 listeners on a monthly basis, but that show is frequently features guests that are CMOs of multinational corporations, like that's a very good signal for us. And actually, that's going to be one of the examples we're going to look at. A show that's only got like a 25 power score, but they've had folks from Nestle, from McDonald's, from PepsiCo, from all of these like major blue chip brands. And there's like a very beneficial thing that happens. One is we can associate kind of like our topics and what we want to talk about with some of these big brands, but it also opens up opportunities for us to see what these folks are talking about and then add additional insights to some of the things that they've already discussed. And we'll see that play out with one of the examples that we're going to do here in a bit. So again, that's going to be content, context, audience, and reach. You're going to be able to use a lot of Podchaser Pro's features to identify some of these things. So content, of course, you're going to use your search queries. You're going to use chart positions, chart categories more specifically. And then also, if you guys aren't aware, we introduced Boolean search just this week, actually. And I know I talked to a couple customers and prospects this week that were very, very happy about that because they're already using Boolean search in their social listening platforms and that sort of thing. So in any case, Boolean search is here, and that's going to help us get a much more or exacting kind of search result experience. So if you haven't played around with it yet, please do. Um, so yeah, that's going to be that side of it. And then on the audience, of course, we're going to use our audience data. On the reach side, we'll use our monthly and per episode reach estimates, but I'd also recommend using chart positions as kind of a proxy for that as well. Again, sometimes clients come to us and say, hey, my client only wants to be on podcasts that have 100,000 listens per episode. It's like, awesome. Would love for that to happen for them. But again, like, what's the value of that, especially if you compare it to, well, it's the number, even if the show's only got 10,000 monthly listens, but it's number 7 for marketing in the US on Apple, like that's also a very good indicator, even if it doesn't kind of satisfy that reach requirement the client's seeking, right? So we can use reach or podcast chart positions as a substitute for reach as well. And then on the context side, so how do we use Pro to do that? A couple of different ways. I would definitely use episode search. We can go into any podcast, go through to the episodes tab, and then open up the search bar and actually type in the keywords that we're looking for. So if it's a general marketing podcast, I want to see if they've talked about podcast advertising before. I'd go to the episodes section of the podcast page in Podchaser Pro and then just type in podcast advertising. If they haven't discussed it, great. That opens up, that's a big gap that we can fill, of course. If they have talked about it, maybe they've only talked about it from a programmatic perspective. They haven't talked about it from a host read endorsement perspective, right? So again, we can use some of the things that they've already done to kind of inform what our pitch is going to look like. And then I think maybe more excitingly after that as well, from a contextual understanding, is also looking at transcripts. So for those that don't know, the top 24,000 podcasts we currently transcribe every episode for now. You can search those transcripts again, just like you could search the episode side. And just a little tease, there might be some more to come when it comes to surfacing transcript level keywords when it comes to just like the general search. So if you go on the top of Podchaser Pro and type in a keyword, maybe just maybe transcript results will show up in there as well. So in any case, that's going to be content, context, audience, and reach. A couple questions. Let's see what we got. Yeah, so good break. So Adrian says proprietary research, first party data is easily one of the top 3 ways to land high quality placements. Not sure why more PR comms people aren't urging clients to invest in this. Absolutely. Um, and Adrian, one of his shows ranks number 2 for marketing in Algeria. Ask me anything. Love that. Cool. So the next thing that we're going to do, and we're going to run Bradley's kind of guest candidacy through this process as well, is looking at the 4A's framework. Now, I didn't come up with this. This was popularized by Dickie Bush, who's a digital writer, former BlackRock investor, who really became a creator, a bona fide creator. And it's a fairly simple concept to think about, but the application can be a little bit messy. So I definitely want you to sit back and follow me a little bit here. But it's the basic premise of it is almost any type of content can be broken down into one of 4 or many of 4 kind of buckets or categories, if we will. So the first bucket is going to be actionable, and these are going to be tactical, implemental pieces of content. These usually are going to look like tips, hacks, curation, resources, ultimate guides, and the reader or the listener should gain some new insight or instruction they haven't beforehand. And the whole kind of like core principle here is to take an idea and then show the audience how to actually put it into practice, right? And when we're looking at actionable through the lens of Bradley's candidacy, this will be like how to. So like how to find guests that frequently, or how to find podcasts that frequently feature guests using Podchaser Pro. That's something he could speak to probably in his sleep backwards in a different language, because that's kind of the core of what we do. How to understand what brand sentiment is, what sentiment it is around your brand in the podcast medium. Again, something that we can do very specifically also serves as kind of a lead generator, because if he's going through these examples of different brands that we're tracking and kind of their mentions over time, we can also take a look at that as well. So again, actionable is going to be very much what it sounds like: how-tos, tips, tricks, and all that sort of thing. So when you're thinking about this from your client side, if like the content they're already publishing or what they're doing in their day to day is like very much on that level, obviously what we're going to want to do is find podcasts that have a much more actionable theme, if you will. And we'll see this in some of the examples to come, but oftentimes in the podcast description, the podcast will say, we're here to give you actionable tips, no theory or BS fluff, things like that. So if we can find those types of kind of call outs, those self-identifiers from the podcast side, and we know we've got a strong angle from our guest side, we want to marry those two things together, because then our pitch becomes a lot crispier. Instead of saying, hey, you can have Bradley Davis, the illustrious CEO of Podchaser, on your show to talk about all things podcasting. That's not going to get, one, very many responses, and two, even if it does get a response, it's gonna be like, thanks, no thanks, right? So instead, if we were to position it like, hey, you saw your podcast is very much focused on, action oriented kind of steps to take. Have an interesting idea for you. Introducing Bradley Davis, CEO of Podchaser, who can show your audience how to find how many people listen to any given podcast in the world using a 3-step process. So like, again, it's just going to make that mesh point a lot stronger. The next A is going to be analytical. So these are going to be breakdowns that involve numbers, frameworks, processes. It's going to take the core idea, support it with data, evidence, and analysis. These are going to look like trends, reasons, numbers, examples, teardowns, case studies, those types of things. Again, Podchaser is uniquely able to do this because we have so much data at our fingertips. And I already kind of beat this horse a bit with the Podchaser 25, but like, what better thing to talk about for a show that is taking an analytical perspective than some of what Podchaser data already produces, right? So there was a podcast run by Justin Jackson, who's the founder of Transistor.fm, and Jeremy Enns, who's a podcast growth consultant. And all they do in their podcast is talk about podcasts that they've found. They tear down kind of like what the pages look like. They tear down some of the content. They identify areas for the podcast to grow. And they also like try to unlock like what the meta is of where podcasts are shifting to. Justin just released a very interesting blog article about the video podcast boom and what that means for traditional audio. And again, what we could position Bradley to do on Justin and Jeremy's show is talk about, yeah, there's so much noise in the market right now about video podcasts, but in looking at the Podchaser 25, which is going to take a look at every podcast that's new, that's published the first episode in the last 90 days, what we found through that data is only 10% of them have a video component to them. So again, we're going to reinforce the host's belief, and we're also going to kind of give the audience the perception that, hey, even if you're not doing video podcasts, it doesn't mean you're not going to be able to own and grow your show, right? So again, that could be an interesting thing where we're going to use our data to kind of prop up the host's pre-existing belief, because ultimately, if they're agreeable to you, that's usually a good sign that they would be interested in having you on as a guest. Cool. So the next thing we'll take a look at is aspirational. And these are going to be stories of how you or others have put ideas into practice. So this is going to sound like lessons, mistakes, personal stories, stories of growth, advice to past self, those sorts of things. I alluded to this when we were going through some of the themes and topics earlier, but entrepreneurship is going to fit very squarely into this aspirational bucket oftentimes, because so many of these side hustle shows or entrepreneur shows or bootstrap shows are going to kind of take this angle in which they want to inspire people to exit the corporate grind and go out and do their own thing. Now, obviously, in Bradley's case, he could very much speak to that. I will say, though, however, that the audience isn't probably isn't going to align as much as what we'd like. So Yes, we obviously work with a number of entrepreneurs. Yes, we obviously have quite a few startups that we work with. But typically, this is going to, the audiences of these types of shows are going to be kind of like calorie free in a lot of ways. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a judgment or a slight on them in the least. It just doesn't align quite as much with some of our commercial priorities as a business. So, what I usually recommend to clients is you don't want to ignore these shows. You definitely want to go on these shows, especially if you've got a really compelling kind of founder story or founder narrative. You want to get some of these placements done because that often builds momentum for your guests' comfortability with the medium, comfortability with speaking to a camera, comfortability with talking into a mic, opening up a recording software, that whole thing. So I usually like to do these early on in campaigns, and hopefully that balloons and gives us a little bit more of kind of pelts on the wall. So if someone from a very specific target audience, if a podcaster from a very specific target audience and very specific content type does ask us for Bradley's, previous podcast guest appearances, and if we don't have anything else but these, that's still a good thing because then the host can actually understand, is he articulate? Is he able to take his ideas and say them and do so in a way that's resonant with an audience? So again, we don't want to ignore these. I don't think we want to make them the central point of most of our guesting campaigns. But again, this is something that there's a lot more volume of shows that are going to fit in this aspirational bucket. And then finally, there's going to be anthropological. So this is a little bit more complex, but these are going to be things that speak to universal human nature. So fears, failures, struggles, paradoxes, observations, comparisons, why others are wrong, and why you've been misled. So um, this, if I were to use a book example for this, this would be like Morgan Housel with The Psychology of Money, where he really breaks down like our relationship with money is as such because of X, Y, and Z reasons that you probably have no understanding or awareness about. Now, from the Podchaser point of view, what would be some of the anthropological reasons or angles that we could play with Bradley? One would be what I already talked about, how fragmented the podcast industry is and how fragmented the data is and how siloed it is. Again, we've got our four key players: Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and Google/YouTube. And a lot of folks don't understand, well, if I publish an episode to Spotify, does that automatically mean it goes to Apple or does it automatically go to YouTube and that sort of thing? And the answer is obviously no. And again, Bradley can unpack why the industry is so fragmented and hopefully kind of paint the picture as to why a solution like Podchaser actually exists, right? So again, that could be a big thing. Some of the aforementioned threads about Google and Meta are also going to exist here. So a lot of marketers or PR folk kind of shy away from podcasts because they don't know how to measure it. And that's because they don't know how to measure it because they've become so reliant on ad tech tools and things like Google Analytics to tell them that they're doing a good job. But Bradley's angle with this could be if you really observed your Google Analytics data, it appears as if Google takes responsibility for nearly every single touch point in a customer journey. Now, how could that possibly be true? Perhaps they're grading their own homework. And this actually happens to be a stance that I hold pretty firmly, that marketers have really become technologists as opposed to like true marketers. And just because a data report shows you something does not necessarily mean that it's true. So again, like marketers have long avoided non-click based attribution solutions because they have no way to measure it. Therefore, this industry, the podcast industry, is vastly undertapped when it comes to performance. If there was one smart marketer in every organization that said, hey, wait a minute, what if we thought outside of our Google Analytics account and actually found audiences that we could get our message in front of, what would actually happen there? And again, this is going to wrap it back into that's why a solution like Podchaser Pro exists. If you are the multicultural marketing team at Coca-Cola and you want to reach Latinx age 25 to 34 males and females, and the only way you've been able to do that historically is through Google targeting or Facebook targeting. Well, what if you could find where these pockets of audience actually exist in the audio format. So again, this is going to be how we're going to tie it back and really make it worth our clients' time and attention. Cool. Couple questions. Take a quick pause. Use those shows for clips. You can amplify your own network where the commercial value is much higher. Yep. John, now I understand why Adrian's number 2 in marketing. Yeah, boom. Love that. Cool. So again, 4A's framework, actionable, analytical, aspirational, and anthropological. And I've mentioned this before, but it does need to be said again. The only reason why we want to do this is to take the perspective of our guests, marry it to that of the podcast, and then use those two kind of synergies, as much as I don't like using that term, use those two synergies and push them together and use that to write a compelling pitch that's going to take the message with the market and fit them together. Cool. All right. So now we will get into show fits. And again, some of this I already did, but we already know some of the topics. We already know the audience that Bradley wants to reach. We already know, so the analytical 4A's framework. We know the CCAR framework as well. The first one we're going to take a look at is Time for a Reset Marketing Podcast, and this is Insights from Global Brands. Now, again, this is just looking at their podcast description. Welcome to the Reset Marketing podcast. We sit down with top marketing leaders. Okay, great. We've already identified that's one of the target audiences we want to go after. Representing the biggest and most beloved brands. Double win for us. We wanted both of those things to happen because we have enterprise offerings. There's a lot more budget that's available with some of these types of organizations. That's going to be a good signal for us. Our mission to uncover secrets behind driving change in today's rapidly evolving world. Now, we just talked about anthropological, and if I scroll back up here, right, one of the kind of factors here with anthropological is fears, failures, struggles, paradoxes, observations, comparisons, why others are wrong, why you've been misled. A lot of that is synonymous with secrets, right? So again, this sends alarm bells off in my head saying, ooh, I've got something here. Now I just need to figure out how exactly I'm going to tie together the Bradley angle with the podcast angle into a pitch that's going to make sense. But we'll keep going. So from understanding change in consumer behavior to recognizing the importance of marketing and driving business growth, shaping the future of marketing. Cool. Well, we already identified that the history of marketing has been, at least in the last decade, has been relying on pay-per-click, whether that's on the social side or the search side. So what's the future of marketing in this cookieless world? Oh, our contextual targeting that we have and our audience targeting that we have through podcasts. So again, alarm bells going off. This looks like a really good fit. Each episode is a treasure trove of actionable takeaways. Okay. If I do recall, our first A in the 4A's framework is actionable and thought-provoking insights. I'm pretty sure insights were included in that actionable as well. Tune in for new episodes, discover how to lead the board agenda, unlock true potential of marketing, and propel your organization forward. The board agenda call out I think is an interesting one. I don't know how much we're going to delve into that, but at least it substantiates the call out of the top marketing leaders representing the biggest and most beloved brands with boardroom. Because if we do gain audience with, let's say the CMO of Nike, who hasn't spent a dime in podcasts, what they're going to have to do is convince their board, right? So how are they going to convince their board? Well, we need to give them some actionable takeaways, and we need to help them understand what the future of marketing looks like because they've been so reliant on some of these traditional channels. So in any case, this looks like a really good one, and we'll actually write a pitch here in a second. But that's all good at face value. Sometimes podcasters can be over optimistic about who they want to reach with their show. So how do we actually substantiate that they are reaching these very desirable kind of target audiences? Well, if we look through this, and you could, this is obviously a screenshot, but you can click into any of these. But this one is an interview with President Javier Meza, who's this Coca-Cola Europe CMO. And through this episode description, we can see discover why he believes marketing should create meaningful value exchanges, how Coca-Cola navigates the evolving landscape through data-driven strategies and AI innovations. Well, that again, alarm bells going off. So one thing that we know, one thing that Bradley knows intimately is how major holding companies, major advertising agencies are leveraging what we call Podchaser's collections, which are going to be AI driven collections of shows that are reaching certain topics or certain audience types. And again, that's going to fit really well into at least what we can see through this description of the European CMO of Coca-Cola's thoughts on where things are going. Also explore the future of the CMO role, the importance of continuous learning and vulnerability. Um, Perfect. So again, looked like a good fit. Alarm bells kept going off, and now I've got something that I can actually kind of parlay into a pitch, which in this case is going to be about how major brands like Coca-Cola are leveraging AI and big data to enter confidently into a new medium, podcasts, uh, with great success. And again, what we can look at too is how much, and Bradley can talk about this very specifically, about how much additional revenue has been unlocked through the podcast medium. We can talk about some of the data studies that we've done about how podcast listeners are the most focused audiences of all, outpacing social by a considerable margin, outpacing television, outpacing connected TV, et cetera. So some of these additional through lines, hopefully for those that are listening to this podcast, will be like, ooh, we are spending a ton of money on connected TV right now, but I had no idea that attention rates were so low with connected TV. It sounds like this podcast thing might work for us, but how do I know that this is going to work? And then that's when Bradley can get into some of the case studies of clients we've worked with and kind of their entry into the podcast world as well. So again, this is very much going to be a fit for us. I'll take a quick pause because I know we're looking at questions. Seen a lot of podcast descriptions that are clearly written by AI. Prefer to rely on past episodes to assess fit. Yeah, exactly. So again, we know that that's a problem, and oftentimes, especially in like our history or history of any kind of media database, right? You're kind of reliant on what the input was from the user because it's getting pulled from somewhere. So by actually looking at the episode transcripts, looking at the episode titles and descriptions, is going to help us a good deal. Just one more quick example here. So this is going to be another one, stories and strategies for public relations and marketing. We tell stories about PR that will inspire your career. So this is going to be a little bit of a different angle, and kind of in that same vein of secrets, maybe the angle that we want to play with Bradley is, hey, some of like the top performing account directors that we work with are actually our Podchaser super users. We worked with a couple individuals at XYZ agency. They started out as account coordinators. They took to the podcast pitching side of the client work very well. All of a sudden, 6 months later, they're account directors, right? So like, again, we would be able to source those types of data points through our client success team and that sort of thing. But again, just kind of noodling here. And straight up, you may not agree with all of them. Neither do we. The point is, these are perspectives and ideas that need to be talked about. So this is good. Again, if we go back to some of the themes that we were talking about, the fracturing of the media landscape and what's going to fill the void, how are people going to consume news, how are people going to be made aware of certain things? Is it all going to be TikTok? Is it all going to be short form video? Well, we think it's going to be podcasts, and here's why. So again, we can tie that back pretty well. From authentic storytelling to harnessing the power of AI and innovative media relations and crisis comms, adapting behavioral science, controversial ideas, some of which work extremely well in politics and business. So one of the things that I know, has already talked about, and he was featured in a podcast with Jeff Umbro, who runs the Podglomerate, was Bradley's prediction for 2025, and that was going to be that politics are taking a much larger position when it comes to the podcast medium. And I know for a fact that We have multiple market research firms that are leveraging our data right now to understand what is happening from a political perspective in the podcast medium. So again, we could already link the host to Bradley's previous episode about that. The tie-in from the product is we've got our podcast political skew data as well, so we can use that and some of the data around that to say, hey, if you do work in and around politics or the convergence of politics and business, which seems like it's completely intertwined at this point, for better or worse, here are some of the things that you ought to know before you enter into the podcast space as well. So, and again, just looking at some of the previous episodes here, brand seeks to cut through the digital noise. Fascinating trend has emerged. Recording conversations with CEOs and decision makers to create authentic, shareable content. So that's something we can talk about as well. We can say, hey, Podchaser has X amount of creator credits and Y amount of those are CEOs of companies. We actually have quite a few of our clients are using our monitoring reports to figure out exactly what the CEOs of certain companies, both their own CEO as well as competitors, are saying on podcasts. So that can dictate kind of their corporate strategy. Investor relations becomes a huge piece of that as well. So again, we can build off of this previous guest's conversation and say, hey, we actually have another layer of insight deeper. And some of it might actually be controversial because we want to play that back into what the podcast has already described itself as. So in any case, that's how we're going to do it. Now, I've got a couple more examples, but I do know we're running up on time. Yeah, there's Greg. I actually saw you in one of the, yeah, you're up here somewhere. You were in one of the descriptions too. Cool. So coming up on time, I know we're starting to get a few folks dropped off, and I know there's one more Q&A. Cool. So as a means of next steps, what we're going to do is I will send over the recording to everybody. With the recording, I'll also send out each of the pitches that I'm going to write for every single one of these shows for Bradley. I don't think we're going to have time to actually do that live, unfortunately. I have a way of over talking, so apologies for that. But this will go out on Tuesday of next week. You can use the email that I put together as a template for your own. But again, I'll call out kind of step by step how this fits into actionable, analytical, aspirational, or anthropological. I'll kind of like piecemeal it out step by step. I'll do highlights and all that fun stuff. And then I'll also, with that, include the list of the shows that we identified as being a good fit for Bradley's candidacy. And then as a follow-up to that, as well, I do go out and actually pitch these shows today and on Monday. I'll let you know which ones actually said yes based on all of this. So you can see if or not, if this works or not. Does that sound fair? Cool. Want help with Doug? Yeah. No, I'm gonna do it raw, Greg. I appreciate the offer. Yeah, but cool. Awesome. Any other questions before we break for the day? No, cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for your time and attention. Again, I'll get all of the recap information out to you by Tuesday of next week. And if you have any questions in the meantime, just holler. But thanks to everybody for coming today. Adrian and Greg, thanks specifically for participating. You guys are good dudes. And everyone have a great weekend. Cheers.